action tracks of the summit. We developed an interfaith statement that was signed by dozens of religious organizations, and we were asked to present that statement in the opening plenary of the summit. Now, since then, September 2021 seems like many, many years ago. We were still in many parts of the world in the pandemic or just coming out. And so since then, we have emerged from the COVID-19 pandemic and entered into a somewhat challenging phase in the world where we're facing multiple crises, whether it's climate change, war, a fracturing of global order and the multilateral system. And so we're really in a very different place today in the world than when we were in 2021 when the summit took place. And so that's why we felt it was important to convene a number of dialogues leading up to the stock-taking moment to hear from different stakeholders about what has happened and what needs to happen going forward. On this session, as I mentioned, we are hearing from representatives from international organizations. And then in a couple of weeks, we have a session hearing from grassroots, activists, and voices. And then we also have a side event happening during the stock-taking moment in Rome. The details of those second two sessions will be shared at the end of today. But turning to today's session, as I said, we are so honored to have a wonderful panel of speakers from a number of organizations that we have worked with over many years. And so I'm just delighted that they could join us here today. I'll run through, I'll introduce each of the speakers and then I'll pose a question to all of them. So first we have Laura Di Mattis, who is a food systems expert at FAO with expertise in project design and management in the areas of food systems, rural development, and microfinance with the UN and NGOs. She provides technical guidance to country teams and leads the planning and implementation of sustainable food systems in the Mediterranean project. And we'll hear about that when we get to Laura. Next, we have Rukshana Subhash, who is the global policy and advocacy expert at the International Land Coalition. He is a lawyer by training, holding an LLM from George Washington Law School and the University of Hong Kong. He has been working in the social justice sector for the last 20 years, particularly in the fields of anti-corruption and human rights, both in the Asia-Pacific region and globally. Next, we have our dear friend, Lena Mahi, who is a technical officer at the World Health Organization's Department of Nutrition and Food Safety. She was the WHO's focal point for the UN Food Systems Summit and a member of the UN Decade of Action on Nutrition, FAO-WHO Joint Secretariat, and the engagement coordinator in the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub. We next have Oliver Oliveros, who is the coordinator of the Agroecology Coalition, which aims to accelerate food system transformation through knowledge sharing, advocating for investments, and seeking political engagement for agroecology. He has extensive experience working on partnership development and fostering inclusive dialogues and networks, and was previously the engagement lead for the Food Systems Summit. And last but not least, we have our very dear friend, Dr. Iyad Abu Mogli, who is the founder and director of UNEP's Faith for Earth initiative, with more than 37 years of experience with international organizations, private sector, and scientific institutions. Dr. Abu Mogli has extensive experience and knowledge about sustainable development, natural resource management, and interfaith collaboration. So we have such an esteemed and august panel. I'm very excited for this conversation. And so I want to start with asking all of you an opening question, which is probably on the lips and the minds of everyone who participated in the Food Systems Summit and is looking forward and looking ahead to the stock-taking moment. And that question, put simply, is that out of the summit in 2021, many commitments were put forward by different stakeholder groups, civil society organizations, indigenous leaders, youth representatives, member states. And these commitments ranged from, supporting food security to eliminating hunger, improving nutrition, to increased financing, promotion of healthy diets, elimination of food waste, climate change and biodiversity were in the mix as well. So there was a lot there that came out of the summit in 2021. And all of you were involved in that summit in various capacities and have been since. So I'd like to ask all of you, What progress have you seen emerge from the commitments and the coalitions that were built during the Food Systems Summit in 2021? And Laura, I would love to start with you with that question.
Thank you, Gopal. Thanks for this introductory question. Thanks to the Center for Earth Ethics and the Faith and Food Coalition for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I would like to answer this question providing the perspective of a few countries, especially from the Mediterranean, as this is the region I currently cover, through the SFS Med project that you mentioned at the beginning. It's a project that is implemented by FAO with a range of partners across the Mediterranean, with a financing of Italy, to actually bring forward the commitment that were made at the summit and accompany a range of countries in their post-summit journey, let's say. And especially I had the pleasure to accompany along this journey Albania, Jordan, and Morocco. And they have all taken a bit different trajectories. If I start with Albania, what I've observed there is that the country decided to bring this policy dialogue from the national arena, where the national pathway was formulated in 2021, to the subnational level, the regional level. So they conducted a series of regional dialogues in several provinces, from the coastal to the mountainous areas of Albania, in order to try to be as inclusive as possible in their policymaking process, which was very interesting to observe, because it brought the conversation closer to actually the agri-food producers, to the farmers, to the entrepreneurs, to the vocational training providers, for example. And then after collecting all of this breadth of information, of needs, of challenges from the field, it brought it back to the national level. And actually last week I was in Tirana, where we had a national dialogue with the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Tourism and Environment to really reflect a bit on what has been emerged from the field and what needs to bring forward this food system transformation. And another peculiarity of Albania is that they chose a specific lever. They identified sustainable agrotourism as a particularly promising sector for a transversal action towards revitalizing rural areas and rural economy by connecting farmers with the market and with agro-food processors more directly, but also to better protect natural resources that are the backbone of a sector like rural tourism or agrotourism. So it was very interesting how they chose one sector that is pivotal to connect with environmental, with social, and with economic sustainability of food system. The case of Morocco is pretty different, because they are being guided by their Generation Green strategy, which is actually trying to combine green growth, so a green transition that is also just. So they want to develop, let's say, more green, energy efficient value chains, but trying to do so also by developing human capital with the collaboration of young entrepreneurs, women, and so on and so forth. And to do so, they are starting from a kind of coordination mechanism, a kind of governance structure that for the first time would make the health sector talk to the agro-industry sector, with the trade sector, and so on and so forth. And so just to conclude, two reflection of this process that I've observed. First of all, that the Stocktaking moment that will take place in a month in Rome is a kind of window of opportunity that these countries are seeing really to accelerate a bit the progress in this agenda, and that because they feel accountable to the global community for the progress made so far. So I think that's an important moment to capitalize on, but also that beyond this type of milestones, we need to keep the engagement moving. So I think it's important to dedicate expertise and funding to accompany the local governments, the national convener of the Food System Summit, towards this, towards a continued action, a continued mobilization of actors in this endeavor. And you will notice that I haven't mentioned faith-based organization yet. So I think that could be the role of this kind of advisor to this national convener, or how to bring new players on board. But we can talk about it more in a minute. Thank you for now.
Thank you, Laura. That's great. And I have an immediate follow-up question to you, which is, it's fascinating to see that two countries have taken very different approaches, and I love how Albania is taking it from the national to the subnational and then the feeding back to the national. I love that, because that's so much part of how we from the Faith Coalition were looking at this work, that it has to go to the grassroots, and how Morocco is trying to bring together different sectors. You mentioned health and tech for the green growth agenda. I'm wondering, from the work you're doing in the Mediterranean, or or more globally, has there been a level of coordination or best practice sharing amongst member states in terms of what is working or how they're approaching it? Or is this Stocktaking moment the first time where member states will be sharing more publicly how they have been engaging since the summit?
So this is something that we are trying also to do with the Mediterranean project in this specific region, and hopefully we could model also in other regions. But it's a dimension that we are still, let's say, building now as we go, because it's very easy in a country level to identify focal points, entry points, contacts, while in a cross-country, at the cross-country dimension, this is a bit more challenging. But we do, for example, engage them in country-to-country exchanges or learning experiences, although it's, I think, it's an area for improvement. So I think if we manage to promote more of these country-to-country exchanges at the Mediterranean level, then one of the reflections that we've been asked also on a more global level, or how can we replicate, how can we have more of these in other regions, in other countries. A particularly challenge of the Mediterranean is that geopolitically it doesn't exist. So we don't have a single geopolitical, let's say, structure that we can refer to, because it's a region at the crossroads between the EU, the League of Arab States, the MENA region, and so on and so forth. So it's a bit of a puzzle.
For sure, that's very, very helpful. Thank you. Rukhsana, I'm wondering if I can turn to you for the same opening question, which is, of all the commitments and coalitions that came out of the summit, what progress have you seen from your organization in terms of what's happened since then?
Thank you so much, Gopal, for the question. I think right now, without substantive research, I think it's maybe difficult to quantify this is the progress which is happening right now, which had happened so far. But we can speak in general terms, in terms of how do you fathom the progress that you can see so far, and then also what are the challenges in current situation. So my organization, International Land Coalition, so our effort is basically to bring land tenure and land ownership and control over land by men, women, also communities. So in that context, the land ownership matters, the control over land and the land tenure of these communities and individuals. Why does that matter in food system? Because from the production of seeds to a disposal of waste, land is at the center of it. And if you have the land ownership, the control and the ownership of land, it gives autonomy over the land, what is the best thing to be planted, and to preserve their traditional food systems, and the continuity of their culture and tradition. And this is, I think, important in the context of faith-based organizations as well, what they believe and then how they want to continue. So in that context, it's important to bring land into the discussion, and even sometimes not individual ownership, but community ownership of land. So what we are trying to do right now in terms of what progress had happened, we are currently doing a research where we are looking into the national pathways to see how land is being mentioned and how land has been prioritized. So if you want to really look into how So this is more or less a desk research where we look into how land rights have been recognized in national pathways. But I think it's very heartening to hear people like Laura was telling at national level, what are the real case studies, what is really happening? Because all this work that we are doing at international level, like we believe would be able to create influence in terms of policy making. But what really matters is what our members doing at the national level. So in that context, I think it's important to mention because the entire UN Food System Summit was convened to achieve SDGs. So what we did so far was we look into the voluntary national reports up to 2022 and checked to what extent land tenure and countries have reported on the land target. So we look into both the VNRs and also we look into SDG data platform of the UN stats. And what we saw was only a handful of countries so far have reported on land and land ownership of men and women under Goal 1, and then women land ownership under Goal 5. I think it's good to mention that, as I said, for the reasons that I mentioned at the very beginning, in terms of food sovereignty and how land is attached to food sovereignty, it's important countries actually make sure that there's equal ownership of land, control and ownership of land between men and women, and also the ownership and control of land by indigenous communities, pastoralist communities, local communities, any other faith-based organization as a community that matters. So saying that, there was a very, I would say, relatively a dismal picture in terms of countries reporting on SDG land targets. Another trend that we have seen also in the last few years is the attacks against land and environmental defenders, which is also a SDG target on SDG 16.10, which we look at, protection of human rights. So people who protect their land against, extractive industries, sometimes encroachment, sometimes land grabbing, there's increased amount of threats to their lives, and also there's increased amount of killings. As of last year, we don't have 2022 data, but based on, it will come very soon, based on 2021 data, almost 3 land and environmental defenders get killed every week, and that's like an alarming number. So I'm going to stop at that point. So I think it's important to hear about the case studies from national level, as well as people who are working like our organization at international level and regional level with local partners. We are trying to quantify to what extent these commitments have been achieved. Yeah, and in the same tone, we look forward to the Stocktaking Summit.
Thank you so much, Rukshana. That's really an interesting picture that you paint, and your word there of dismal, that only 2 countries, I think you said only 2 countries have mentioned land in their
7 countries, sorry.
7 countries, yeah, of almost 200. So there's definitely work to be done there, and your comment on land defenders and the threats that they face is something very much that we were aware of and kind of incorporated into the work we did engaging faith actors, because we see the role that faith actors can put, the positive role that we can play when it comes to that. I'd like to turn it over to Lena, who was a very dear friend during the lead up to the Food Systems Summit, and it's been a delight to stay in touch with you since then. You were very much at the heart of the Food Systems Summit. Would love to hear what you've seen, what you've heard since the summit, what progress has been made from your perspective.
Thank you so much, Gopal, and hi to everyone, and thank you for allowing me to speak. I want to make 5 points about what's the progress, or maybe just what's the change, and leave it to the participants to assess whether it's progress. But before that, I want to again congratulate you as Interfaith organization for the statement that you've made, because I read it again in preparation of this webinar, and it's honestly, it's so good. It's so like right to the point, and it does not avoid the elephants in the room that might sometimes have been avoided in some of the discussions of the Food Systems Summit, and which I hope will not be avoided this time for the stock-taking moment. So I encourage the participants to read it again, because it's also very much aligned in what WHO is doing with regard to promoting their evidence-based policy packages, whether it's about regulating the unethical marketing, protecting breastfeeding, which is the first food system and which is entirely part of the food system. But I'll not go into that. But I just wanted to say that really it's a good one. So my 5 points. What about the progress or the change since the Food Systems Summit? First of all, I think there has been the sad opportunity of the COVID pandemic and also the different wars. I don't want to take out one because war is going on different fronts. That really showed that there can be courageous and strong policy measures taken if the need is there. So for me, that is like, okay, so there's no excuse why that shouldn't happen more. We have shown that it can happen by countries joining together to protect certain food value chains, to in their country protect or support and strengthen the social protection systems. It has happened, and so there's no excuse anymore that oh, it's too difficult, oh, this takes a lot of time. So that's, I think, a very important thing to highlight. So overall, these sad opportunities of the pandemic and the wars have also shown the importance of resilient food systems for healthy diets. I mean, I've been around quite some time now on this planet, and as a nutritionist, I've never seen such attention globally on the importance of food systems, on the importance of food systems producing healthy diets, on the importance of nutrition. And you see that also in outcome documents that have been produced since the Food Systems Summit, whether we talk about Stockholm Plus 50, or whether we talk about the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, but also the recently concluded G7 documents. It's amazing. It talks about sustainable food systems. It talks about healthy diets. So there's also the UN Decade of Action resolution that was just in May, resolution 285 was adopted. Again, it talks about scaling up nutrition and aligning with the food systems follow-up processes. So really, that's important as well. What's important also is the attention dedicated to One Health approaches. So having both human health, animal health, and ecosystem health combined. There's the quadripartite now, where there's also FAO that is a member. So this coming together of systems is important, and it's starting to happen. Second point, linking food systems with climate change. I mean, this is now also really coming up. COP26 modestly, COP27 already larger, and COP28 promises to really highlight the importance of food systems transformation if we want to achieve or stay below the 1.5 degrees. Third point, again, linking food, energy, and finance by like the UN Secretary General that set up this global crisis response group on food, energy, and finance. Again, those systems are linked. And for us, it was like, wow, they're talking about food. They're bringing in recommendations of what countries can do. That's amazing. Fourth point, overall increased awareness of the impact of what we eat and how we produce it. And there I'd like to just highlight the caveat that there is also an increased polarization going on positions, for example, about the role of meat. Should we reduce it? How should it be produced? Should we go to more plant-based diets, which WHO says it needs to happen, and the IPCC also says it needs to happen. But it's it's sensitive and very political. Also, for example, the increased awareness of ultra-processed foods, that is really coming up with a lot of research, a lot of attention to it. And then my last point, which I also think it is really striking to see increased talk, publications, and evidence on how unequal the food system is and how it is linked to colonialism, neocolonialism, racism. The Lancet just produced a report on health and racism. So power imbalances. This is all coming up, and rightly so, because it has deep-rooted impacts on the way our food systems looks now. So in conclusion, I think the need for food systems transformation is clear. It's in our face, it's obvious, and definitely from the UN system, the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General really take a very big interest in food systems transformation. They will both be at the stocktaking moment. They call food systems transformation one of the 7 big transformations that need to happen to achieve the SDGs. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Lina. Those 5 points, I mean, they're just excellent. And it's great to see, as you're saying, just like the normalization or the mainstreaming of talking about food systems in a variety of contexts, whether it's health or, you know, the impact of racism, you know, and diet and climate. And so it really does feel like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like to me from your 5 points, it sounds like the direction is good. It's going in the right direction. Obviously, we can probably unpack if it's going quick enough. And then your point about how COVID showed that if we come together, we can have transformational change very quickly if there is the political will to do that. So this is all great. Thank you so much for sharing those 5 points. And we've put in the chat, thank you for giving a shout out to our interfaith statement. We've put that in the chat for folks to see it if they haven't already read that. And thank you, Lina, for all of your help as we were drafting and, you know, and writing that a couple of years ago. And similarly, I would like to turn to Oliver. Oliver, you are a dear friend. You worked with us closely, and you were one of our champions in the Food Systems Secretariat as we were trying to mobilize faith groups and engage with the different action tracks. And so you're still in that space, and I would love to hear from your perspective what progress or what developments you've seen since the summit.
Oh, thanks very much, Gopal. And I just want to compliment Lina as well in terms of her statement about the interfaith. That is really, really powerful. For me, that's one of the highlights of my engagement within the UN Food Systems Summit as well, really seeing the interfaith community coming together. And that is one of the things that I see continuing, from the initial engagement we've had. We co-organized several of those dialogues, and this community continues to organize those dialogues and conversations way beyond the summit process. And that's really, really very encouraging. So that dialogue continues. And I think that really proves the importance of this community brings in the conversations around food systems. That's one. The second point, and Lina touched upon this, is the different wars that we're experiencing now that really highlight the importance to think long-term, that there is no substitute for shortcuts, that we really need, if we want to be really serious in transforming our food systems, we really need to make sure that we are looking at the long-term solutions. Otherwise, we will continue to be dependent on global supply chains, for example. And we've all experienced it during COVID, that regardless of how much money you have, there isn't any food available in supermarkets or in the markets. What happens? People started, putting up their vegetable garden. People started learning how to cook and everything. So that brings us back to basics, right? So that is a lesson for us to really take into account, go back to basics and really look at long-term solution. The third point that I want to mention, I probably am in a quite unique position because I was once in the secretariat, but now I see myself leading the secretariat of one of the coalitions which came out of the Food Systems Summit. process, and the way coalitions for actions were defined, it's probably one of those game-changing solutions. And I really see a lot of power and promise in all of these solutions that were put together as a result of, or probably despite of, the Food System Summit process as well, because people saw the importance of coming together, joining forces. The one in Agroecology Coalition, which I have the privilege and responsibility to lead, for example, is really looking at accelerating food systems transformation through agroecology. And we're looking at it in 3 different angles, or different entry points. One is really how you facilitate co-creation of knowledge around agroecology, building on science, building on what is traditional, and building on what is indigenous, and use all of this as evidence to feed into a second work stream, which is really pushing for increased investments in agroecology. It has agroecology and related approaches from regenerative agriculture and whatnot, has really gained momentum in the last 5-10 years. But currently, this level of recognition, well, the level of investments that we see in these things are not commensurate in the level of recognition that it is receiving. So the coalition is really advocating for increased investments in agroecology by convening donors, advocating for increased investments, pushing for them to put their pockets where their mouth is. The third one is really making use of the global policy conversations to advocate for food systems transformation through agroecology. And that's why you see us, the coalition, you would see us present in the Food System Summit Stocktake process and beyond, in the CFS conversations, in the conversations around the 3 Rio Conventions, because we all really need to make sure that we are embedding conversations on food systems and agroecology and every other lever that we could use to transform food systems in mechanisms that already exist, right? And as of now, we have these 3 Rio Conventions, and countries are committing themselves. It's a binding commitment that they have compared to, the food systems process, which is really more voluntary. So we really need to make sure that we are engaging in those policy conversations, because countries have no choice but to respect and honor their commitment to these conventions. And I think there is really a traction that we're seeing there. From Bonn Climate Conference all the way up to Dubai and beyond, the CBD conversations as well, and the certification conversations. So I really see the momentum that has been catapulted by the Food System Summit process. But I think the challenge for us is to not lose sight of the momentum, but also to be more vigilant in terms of the whole process, because there's a lot of organizations or group out there which are riding on the bandwagon and using it for brainwashing or greenwashing and whatnot. So we really need to be very careful and really vigilant on all these processes. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Oliver, for sharing your points there. And really, it felt like you were really building on what Lena shared, which is that, there is momentum, this conversation is being normalized and mainstreamed into a variety of forums. And you mentioned specifically the Rio processes. And then also just flagging the greenwashing concerns. And we know there were concerns by a number of stakeholders in leading up to the Food Systems Summit around, which voices was it including and so on like that. So that's a really important point, and we're grateful that you brought that up. Like Dr. Iyad Mowgli, I wonder if I can turn to you now. Dr. Iyad, you're such a dear friend. You work with faith-based organizations. You're such an excellent champion of our work. You see the importance of it. From your perspective, from UNEP and Faith for Earth, what progress, what movement have you seen since the summit in 2021?
Thank you, Gopal, and good evening, everybody. First of all, let me congratulate you, as Lena did, and everybody else. You personally, Andrew and Karina Gore from the Center for Earth Ethics, for championing the dialogue sessions that we have had over a few months and resulted in a very succinct and very useful interfaith statement. So all the gratitude and admiration is due to your leadership. I mean, I've been listening to my friends and colleagues on this call, and they have almost covered, the prospects and what is happening. So let me focus on what UNEP has been doing as an organization. We tackled the triple planetary crisis, which is overarching. Food systems has something to do with pollution, with climate change, with biodiversity, and we've seen the CBD and how they tackled the issue. But UNEP has been focusing some of its programs on the food systems transformation through what we call a multi-pronged approach, including, as was mentioned, One Health, nutrition, food waste, and regenerative and resilient agriculture. These are the points of focus for UNEP. But as you know, the enabling conditions for all of this is sustainable finance. As financing for nature and biodiversity is far below what must be available. So let me highlight 5 areas where UNEP has been making efforts to achieve that transformation. The first is related to financing. So UNEP is partnering with the banking sector and countries to move capital towards sustainable agriculture. That is specifically to avert deforestation. And we have been partnering with our friends and partners from the Dutch, and who have committed 1 billion in loans to farmers and corporate clients by 2025 through what is known to be the Agri-3 Fund. UNEP has also been working on standardized key performance indicators, or what is known as KPIs, with banks and impact investors. And these KPIs measure the positive climate, forest, biodiversity, livelihood impacts. So creating the foundation for an alternative asset for deforestation-free assets. UNEP is also working on Green Gigaton Challenge to seek more corporate commitments and establish minimum prices for forest carbon. The second area of work that UNEP has been working on is food loss and waste. And with our partners, the Food Agricultural Organization, our sister agency, UNEP issued a call for action on the International Day of Awareness of Food Loss and Waste, actually last year in September 2022. And this tackles the scourge of food loss and waste, represents a triple win opportunity for in fact, linking climate with food security, as well as the sustainability of agri-food systems. The third area is diets, which is very important. And during the EU Agricultural Outlook Conference, UNEP and the EU have issued a pathway for action on sustainable and more diverse diets and food waste and loss. Such a pathway is critical to breaking the system lock-ins, that we call them, that drive the increase of agriculture and the conservation of natural ecosystems to crop production and pasture. Plant-based diets, as mentioned in particular, improve human health and for sure slow climate change. The fourth area of support that UNEP has been working on is an outcome, or as an outcome of the summit, is a new coalition launched by FAO, UNEP, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, which is known as GAIN, C40, the Cities 40, UN Habitat, and others. And this will leverage the knowledge, resources, and multi-level partnerships in support of urban food systems that are sustainable and take nature into account. The last area where I would like to highlight our work is that, there are 100 countries that committed to national food systems pathways after the summit. But many governments still lack the knowledge to design and implement these pathways through their laws and policies and other measures. This is why UNEP, FAO, and UNDP launched what we call the Rethinking Food Systems, a guide for multi-stakeholder collaboration. This guide aims at supporting stakeholders, government and others, working towards the sustainable transformation of their food systems at all levels of the value chain. It will also help governments and policymakers working on efforts such as the national pathways for food systems transformation. So this is just a summary of what UNEP has been engaged with, and I just wanted to share that with you. Thank you, Gopal.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iyad. You said that's a summary. You know, that's a long summary. There's so much good work that UNEP is doing, and no wonder you and your colleagues there in Nairobi are always so busy, because so many great efforts there. And I want to follow up now with all of you with a question around the specific role of how faith-based organizations or a faith lens could help keep moving things forward, but also maybe to energize different aspects of this work. But before I ask that question, we will be opening the floor to questions from the attendees. And so if you have a question for the panelists, I know some are already coming in, please put them in the chat, and we'll have time to get to those shortly. But yeah, as I said, I want to ask this question, and it's come up in the chat. Is, we are a faith-based coalition. We put out a faith statement. We have certain values that we said we want to see reflected in our global food systems. And at the same time, we recognize, although faith is a strong force for good in the world, there are many people who do not subscribe to a faith tradition, but people are all motivated by a certain set of values or beliefs or understanding about how the world is or how it should be. And so, wondering to all of you, what role do you see in either in the area of work that you're in, or in the global, or in the more broader conversation around the inclusion of faith-based organization or faith values or spiritual led messaging? And I think we'll go in reverse order from where we started. So and ask that you keep remarks to a couple of minutes so we can get to the questions from the attendees. But Dr. Iyad, I wonder if I can start with you with that one.
Thank you very much, Gopal. So yes, there are coalitions that have started between faith-based organizations, but let's look beyond faith-based organizations. What we need to do is to build partnership with other stakeholders. So link faith-based organizations with other stakeholders, NGOs, private sector, policymakers, and businesses in general. And this will get us out of the shell of talking to one another and doing the same old thing between faith organizations. Second, we need to establish a meaningful dialogue between stakeholders in the food systems and the faith-based organizations. And this is very much in line with what you have done as Center for Earth Ethic in leading to the summit. The third area, we need to emphasize the importance of ethical practices within the food systems. And of course, faith-based organizations can bring those values and moral responsibility like stewardship, social justice, interconnectedness, the ones that are mentioned in the interfaith statement, to the forefront of discussions by policy makers and decision makers. And of course, that leads us to the necessity of collaborating with decision makers in international fora. For example, we are having the upcoming United Nations Environment Assembly. This is a very important arena, platform where faith organizations can voice their value-based systems in terms of not only food systems, but everything that is related to that. And finally, of course, we do need to do a lot of awareness and capacity building within our own organizations. Some of us are very, very well versed in the understanding they need to do and so on. But many of our partners, our followers of faith organizations don't. So a lot of awareness and advocacy needs to be invested in. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Iyad, with some very clear recommendations around the building of partnerships, of dialogues, engaging in key moments, like you're saying, the UN Environment Assembly coming up next year, and then advocacy, both, to external stakeholders, but also within faith-based organizations themselves. I remember when we were looking into mobilizing faith communities on the Food Systems Summit, I was on a call with a very prominent interfaith organization, and someone there said, well, what do we have to say about food? And it was interesting that it's sometimes not seen as something that faiths can talk about, but the reality is, food is the one thing that all faiths have in common, in terms of we all come together to celebrate over food. We can disagree or we can have different stances on so many things, but I think we all agree good, healthy food is the basis of good, healthy communities. And so I really appreciate that last point about doing the internal advocacy within faith-based groups. I'd like to turn back to Oliver, and same question to you. You've seen us engaging. Where or what do you think could be helpful to keep moving this work forward from a faith perspective?
Fantastic, thank you. I think one of the things that the Food Systems Summit process should really capitalize on is the power of the network of faith-based organizations. This community has probably one of the strongest, if not the strongest, anchors at the grassroots. Not because of the mere presence in the grassroots, but because it is really touching on something that is personal. And if we want food systems transformation, it's around behavioral change. And when we talk about behavioral change, we're really looking at the innermost of a person, right? His or her own value system, so what she believes. And I think this is what you are really bringing onto the table. You talk about faith, whatever you call it, whatever you believe in, it's really looking at the deepest part of one's self. And I think that is something that this group should really harness on, the outreach, that personal approach to addressing food systems issues as a behavioral issues, right? And this is something that is really difficult to handle, and something that people won't necessarily want to approach because we feel like, oh, that's so personal a space. You don't go there. But the fact of the matter is, we all talk about behavioral change. And what is behavioral change without looking in introspection of who we really are? And I think this is something that this community could really, really anchor its work on. Looking at what your network in the community is doing, looking at what the parishes are doing, building on mechanisms that exist. As a Catholic, for example, I go to my church and talk to my parish. I know that Laudato Si is there. What is the program of my local parish that I could build on to that issue? We all know in the Bible that there is a stewardship role that we are given about nature. How do we build on those values and belief system that we all grew up with, or things that are very important for us personally? I think you really need to, and that's an important and very powerful thing that only this group could have, I think. Really touching on the very personal dimension. And if we are able to touch upon the hearts and the minds of the people, then I think everything else will follow. That is really, really powerful. And then you could anchor that to the other allies that you have, those civil society groups that are really working on issues around social justice, equity, social justice, and everything around it is really, really important. So that's where you could really organize yourselves into one internally and then externally from allied and partners that you could work with. Over.
Thank you so much, Oliver. As I mentioned earlier, you have been such a great champion of our coalition and our approach. And I actually want to follow up with a question based on what you said, which is, I think for a lot of people from the faith community, they may feel like, well, Does the UN, do these international organizations, do they care about faith? Is there an opportunity? And in some UN agencies, like obviously Dr. Iyad's program at Faith for Earth, and in other agencies, there is a strong element and a commitment to working with faith-based groups. And I'm just wondering, from the conversations you've had with your colleagues in the food systems spaces, how much is this shared amongst your colleagues? Because I feel like that would really help us know what's the level of interest there.
It really depends on what language you use, what vocabulary you use. If you talk about faith and religion, that word probably comes off as like, "Arr!" But if you talk about principles, when you talk about values, that is something that people could live with. And probably that's how they think, they look at these words and concepts as something that is probably not too personal, that would allow them sufficient, that they would allow them to think that this is not becoming too close comfort in terms of conversation. So I think if you frame the conversations around values and principles, that would be a very good entry point to start with. And I think nobody would say no when you talk about principles. That's how, let's say, I'm just looking at agroecology, for example. You have 13 principles of agroecology. In FAO, they use the language of elements, the 10 elements of agriculture. Who would disagree with all those things which are universal in nature? So you could use those framing, those jargons, those vocabularies as entry point, and so that people won't feel, that the approach is becoming too intrusive, so to speak. So if we get the right framing and the right massaging of the message, I think, it wouldn't be difficult to have those types of conversations. Over.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Oliver. That's very helpful to get an inside perspective, in terms of how to message and effectively communicate what we all share, but we all speak with it with different languages from different perspectives. And so, again, Lena, you, the same question. You've been a great champion, like Oliver and others, with this work. With the stocktaking moment coming up, and this work continuing around the transformation of food systems and the commitments that were made in the summit, where and how can faith-based approaches be most effective to move things forward?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and it's an interesting conversation that we're having. I mean, I agree with Iyad that said that faith-based organizations have a moral leadership, and I think that is really important to, like, as a moral compass in the whole food systems transformation discussion, because also Oliver in the beginning said we have to be. Let me see what he said. We have to be vigilant of certain processes, and I couldn't agree more. And I think faith-based organizations can play that role of being that vigilant stakeholder that will point out that certain processes will not go in the right direction or are misused. And it's also linked with your statement as well, for example, with regard to using local knowledge, indigenous people's knowledge, evidence-based science to guide in policy discussions. And linked to that, I want to mention that also as WHO, we had analyzed the national pathways that were developed in February 2022. So at that time, there were 110 national pathways, and only 3 of them mentioned that it's important to consider conflict of interest, with regard to food systems transformation. And for especially for WHO, as we are a normative agency, it's very important that whatever we recommend with regard to food systems, with regard to policies that work, that they are not or free from conflict of interest. And I think faith-based organizations have a role here. And the second point that I want to mention is that linked to the moral leadership, there is also the power of good policy making. And in that regard, the faith-based organizations, you're huge, you're massive, and you also manage huge funding sources. And just imagine that whatever you pay for or support, whether it's your schools, your hospitals, your social protection systems that you set up, you provide food in schools, in prisons, whatever. Just imagine that through your own policies, you ensure that this food is healthy, equitably produced, sustainably produced. I mean, that could again already shift the needle, because if you add this up in all the countries, this is a massive amount of investment that would go in ethically produced and healthy food. So I would say practice what you preach, and change your own policies already with regard just public food procurement. That would already be a big step in the right direction. Over.
Yeah, I love that final line, practice what you preach. And then I have a friend, a colleague of mine, who would say, practice what you preach and then preach what you practice, you know, so they go hand in hand. So I love that framing. Thank you, Lena. Rukhsana, same question to you. You know, you'd mentioned earlier before we started that your organization works a lot with frontline communities, indigenous communities, and so on. And that's definitely part of the work of our coalition, of our faith coalition, is to be in alignment and support various stakeholders, recognizing that in some spaces faith can be challenging, but we are all aligned in terms of the overall values and the changes that we want to see. So wondering if you could share a little bit in terms of where and how you think faith could be helpful in the work you're doing.
Yeah, sure, Gopal. I think maybe in that context, it would be good to reiterate your principles and values. So if you look at the principles and values, they incorporate interdependence, truth, reverence, respect, compassion, solidarity, and empowerment. I particularly want to say, you know, whose values are these in general? The communities that we work with, indigenous peoples, local communities, they have a very different relationship with the earth, the land that they grow food. So they hold the land that they grow food or that they live on or they depend on, like they consider that to be a sacred entity. So their relationship is very different. So we have to see in that context, where does the challenge come from, right? Who's grabbing their land and why we are not recognizing their right to land. So we have created over the years an economic model actually, which is coming in conflict with these values, right? So this interdependence, the truth, relevance, and this economic model actually paving the way for like a super rich 5% in the world to have like a very comfortable life in the expense of local communities, indigenous people, pastoralists, like not having access to their food, not having access to their land, not having access to their customs and lifestyle. So that's the expense that they have to pay, you know, with their land. So I think we need to look at, when you look at all the values that we have highlighted, these values are very much incorporated in their lifestyle of these communities, right? So it's a matter of like recognizing. So for me, recognizing their land rights formally is a way of recognizing these interfaith values as well. So we were talking about building capacity. So I think if you look at building capacity on these values, I don't think we have to build capacity of indigenous communities, pastoralists, and local communities on these values. We have to shift the attention to the other parties who are more powerful, but have less respect towards these communities. And we need to build their capacity. How do you really understand them, right? And how do you make sure that their rights are not being violated and infringed? So we need to focus the attention to the other spectrum and say, like, if you really need to build sustainable food system, we need to go hand in hand with these values, which are the utmost values of these local communities. I'm going to finish this by saying, I think this is, I'm not going to put like a percentage into this, but still, large amount of world food comes from smallholders, and that includes like a women farmers and indigenous people's food system and local communities food system, and how pastoralists are actually providing meat to certain communities. It's not coming from industrial farms. right? Despite the fact that 1% of the world biggest 1% of the world's biggest farms actually have 70% of the world's farmland based on our research. Still, a large amount of food is being produced and given to people to eat by local smallholders. And I think we need to look at okay, we need to respect their values, which actually in unison with the values that you are promoting. And we need to build capacity of these people who are at the other end.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Rukhsana, bringing up those really, really important points. And if I can, Laura, I will come to you, but there's a question which just builds on what Rukhsana shared. So I'd like to pose that to him. And the question came in that in most Western democratic countries, and this particular question comes from someone in New Zealand, they're saying that land is a private commodity and is aggregating into larger company and family ownership. And so the question is, how can we achieve wider land ownership for communities, indigenous groups, women, without reforming political systems? Does that make sense? Is that something you could maybe speak to?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very, very broad question to start with, but I think I would look at, there are two aspects of looking at it. Like when you talk about food system, when you have to look at the agrarian reforms, right? And who is actually benefiting from these agrarian reforms? If we smallholder farmers and smallholder community, like smaller communities, are feeding large proportion of the world's population, actually these agrarian reforms have to benefit them, including people who have been working on land without titles to them. That includes, as I said, recognizing indigenous people food system, and then the pastoralist food system, and then the role of smallholders, agroecology, and all those things. And agrarian reforms actually have to create an enabling environment for that to happen. And also, we are living in an era of climate change. And who's contributing to the climate largely, right? Who is actually looking after ecosystems based on the values that we have been talking about? It is these communities who are at the grassroots level. It is these communities who are at the ground level. So if we really want to work on, we have forgotten, because we keep looking at larger solutions and depriving these communities and pushing them to the margins further. We need to reverse the discussion, have new kind of thinking. And that actually need to move out of our comfort zone and look at the new economic models and what the corporate food systems have really created in the world today.
Sure. Thank you so much, Rukhsana, for that. As you said, it's a big topic, and I'm sure we'll find time to dive into that in other spaces. Laura, to you, that same question which I'm posing to everyone, which is, in your work, where do you see, and if so, where do you see and how do you see the role of a faith lens or faith perspective move this work forward?
Thank you, Gopal. Definitely, I agree with my fellow speakers today that, let's say, that the values that you are putting forward and how you are phrasing them are coming into our work, just with different vocabulary, maybe. So if you talk about compassion, definitely we talk about, when we talk about just transition and having marginalized communities at the forefront of climate transition, that's what we mean. So to uplift and to empower, let's say, the people that are that usually are not at the forefront of the climate tech transformation, for example. Or if you're talking about respect of indigenous tradition, this is something that is very at the core of, for example, the Mediterranean diet, where we try to promote, let's say, traditional recipes or autochthon varieties of breeds and crop varieties. That and the slow food movement, if you are familiar with that, is all about this kind kind of indigenous breeds and crops. So it's just a matter, I think, of matching, of doing this kind of critical review of what are the interfaith statement, for example, values with what is matching the, I don't know, national roadmap or national pathway. And online, there is a wealth of information on what are the country's, let's say, priorities for food system transformation. So I think it's a matter of the faith-based organization to really be able to position themselves as food systems actors. So everyone is a food system actor. We are all consumer. We all make consumption choices. So we all have a say into how the food that is on our plate is produced, is consumed, is distributed. So I think really it's a matter of a critical reflection, or okay, what is the competitive advantage that as faith-based organization we can bring to the food system transition agenda. And of course, it's mutual, because also I think the work that you're doing even today is also a bit about raising awareness of the UN agencies in widening their stakeholder base and thinking, okay, why are we reaching out maybe to religious leaders when we develop a rural development project in a specific community, but we are not bringing in faith-based organization in policy discussions. So I think it's also a matter of elevating the engagement of faith-based communities. In terms of the role, I think it's undeniable that all the food redistribution, for example, it's a key aspect where faith-based organization can play a role. Or food waste awareness. I was in Egypt several years. I lived there several years, so I'm a bit familiar with all the Eid celebrations, all the Muslim let's say festivals, where a lot of food waste unfortunately happen. So as FAO, I remember we used to have campaigns for food waste awareness, prevention of food waste during Ramadan, for example, but I don't think we partner with faith-based organizations. So there, okay, it's about making this kind of links where we as UN, we can look a bit more broader at our stakeholder base, and the faith-based organization have to knock on the policymakers' door and really say, okay, this is what we can offer, and this is what is matching our values with your work. And I think I will leave it at that.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura. And really, really excellent contributions and thoughts from all of you in terms of how and where, you know, a faith lens or a faith approach can be helpful in all of the aspects that all of your organizations cover. We have about 10, 12 minutes or so for some questions. There are some that have come through in the chat. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll aim to get to as many of them as possible. And so I'll just run through them and I'll pose them to the panel, and then people can, you know, the panelists, you can decide who wants to answer them. Some of them you've answered already in the chat, but I just want to bring them up so everyone can hear the answers. And so one of the questions that came in was around processed foods, and what role do processed foods play in the transformation of food systems. Man, speaking for myself, and I'm sure many others, we all love certain kind of processed foods that we know are unhealthy for us, but there's the convenience factor and definitely a taste factor in a lot of them. So Laura, I see you answered this in the chat, so I'm wondering if you wanted to elaborate on that, and anyone else who wants to pick up on that specific point around the role of processed foods.
Yes, absolutely. I'll repeat a bit what I put in the chat. So as you were saying, it's undeniable the power of packaged and processed food in terms of taste, convenience, sometimes, unfortunately, even affordability, because I'm living in London at the moment, and sometimes it's much cheaper to buy ultra processed food than to buy organic, fresh food from a farmer's market. But at the same time, I think since we cannot get rid of it, okay, what we can do is, as Iyad was saying, I think earlier, call on the corporate, on the food industry to improve the nutritional content of such food, would be one. And then now there is an amazing world of opportunity offered by circular economy. So, for example, using upcycled ingredients or upcycled packaging. So, for example, I've just became aware of a company that is producing ketchup or mayonnaise using leftover surplus fruit and veg instead of sugar, instead of other ingredients that are normally used in mayonnaise and ketchup. So there are opportunities, and I think we cannot get rid of it, but just make it better, let's say.
Can I come in here as
yes,
well?
Yes, please do. Please do.
Yeah, so I think it's already very important to make a difference between processed food and ultra processed foods. And what I was specifically mentioning is the ultra processed foods, which are not really foods anymore, which are just products, I would say. I mean, processing has been going on for millennia. I mean, making flour and having fermentation of foods to increase the life of foods and reduce the food waste. So I think it's really important to make that difference. And I acknowledge that for the moment also there is not yet a globally agreed definition of foods and ultra processed foods. There is a classification which is called the NOVA classification, and scientists are really working very hard to show that indeed it's more than just what the salt and the unhealthy fats or the sugar that is in the ultra processed foods, because there are plenty of additives and stabilizers and whatever products that are in there that seems to also have in itself also a negative impact on our health. So that's an important difference to make. I would also think, okay, we can't get rid of ultra processed foods. Why not? I mean, I wouldn't just say that, oh, this is a situation that we have to live with. Again, I come back to policies and repurposing subsidies, making the healthy food more accessible and affordable for everyone. And that's what Healthy Diets for All is about, that we ensure that people can make a choice, because not everybody has a choice to choose healthy foods. Like Laura says, you have the food deserts. You're working 3 jobs. You don't have time. To prepare your food. So of course you need to buy ultra processed foods, because it's around the corner and you can do it quickly and you can make the family happy because the stomach is full. But that's not what it is about. And that's the violation of the right to food that we have. So we have to get the subsidies to the healthy foods and regulate the ultra processed foods to make sure that it nudges people to making the choice and give them the choice of choosing the healthy foods. So it's then also linked with economic systems, because people that don't have the time, I mean, they need to be able to sit down after work and be able to go to the market, to the local market, and prepare the food. So it's all linked. Laura mentioned circular economy. I mean, I do think that if we want to truly transform food systems, we also truly have to transform economic systems and redefine what profit making means. It might mean making sure that everybody is healthy. That's a huge profit that companies could work towards. But for that, you have to convince the shareholders, etc., etc., etc. But don't give up hope.
Thank you, Lina. Oliver, did you want to come in on this specific question?
Not very specific, but since Lina touched about the transformation, I think one thing that we haven't touched upon as well is the education system. And I think this is an important leverage that the faith communities would also have. Each faith would have their schools. You have Catholic schools, you have Christian schools, you have et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that is not often emphasized in schools is the value of food and food systems and everything that is around it. So I think that's another leverage that this community could touch upon and impress upon the students, especially the kids, like demanding from what they eat in the canteen to what is being taught in school. So from there, you would be able to touch upon different areas from procurement to everything else. Over.
Great, thank you, Oliver. Got a few more minutes. I have two questions, and I'm trying to merge some of the questions together so we can address as many of them as possible. There are a couple of questions that have come in around the role of meat and industrial livestock production. Dear friend Joyce De Silva is attending from Compassion in World Farming, and she posed that question. So I'm just wondering, if anyone would like to answer, like, what is the role of meat? We understand that there's a need for increased plant-based diets, as you had mentioned, Lena and others. But in terms of meat, industrial animal agriculture, where does that fit in terms of the transformations that we need to see? Who wants to be brave enough to try and answer that? Oliver, did you want to go on that first?
Go ahead, Lena. I think she raised her hand first.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, everything is context specific. I mean, if we talk about the global level, the evidence is clear. We have to reduce our meat consumption globally, but that doesn't mean that in certain areas in the world there needs to be an increase in meat consumption for certain groups. WHO is preparing an information brief on the role of red meat and processed meats, many shades of red and green, we are calling it, seeing what's the impact on health and environment. And we hope to publish it in the coming month, which puts everything together, which shows that it is context specific. And in one region, you might, like for young children, animal sourced food are an incredible rich source of micronutrients, et cetera, but it's also the way that the meat is produced. And indeed, industrial production does have a lot of negative impacts on health, on the planet, and it could be revised. But definitely with regard to the role of meat in a healthy diet, there is a role, but it's how it's being produced. And we definitely also acknowledge that certain faiths, for certain faiths, there is no role for meat in the diet. And we don't want to kind of say, oh, you have to obligatory eat meat. So that information brief from WHO might be the start towards a process to see whether it is possible to provide global guidance on meat consumption. But again, I mentioned it in the beginning, it's extremely sensitive because it's not only about health, it's also about trade of certain meat exporting countries. So it's very political. And so it needs to be an evidence-based conversation without emotions taking over, without profit-making taking over, and that's very challenging. Over.
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask Iyad. I want to see if Iyad has any thoughts on that question. And Rukhsana, my last question is actually going to be to you on land use, so maybe we can put these two together. But Iyad, you're working with different faith traditions across the world, and the sensitivities and the contours of where we can move certain faith groups. Where do you come in on this question around meat consumption and plant-based diets?
Well, I mean, Lena has really eloquently, mentioned what I wanted to say. I mean, religions do not force you to completely move into a plant diet and plant-based diet. And there are religions that actually have festivals based on animals, which is fine. And, protein that exists in animals is very much needed. But we are talking about industrially produced animals, or slaughtered, used, manufactured, transported, and so on. And there's a difference, right? The factory or produced massive production of meat is causing climate change, is causing waste, is causing pollution, is causing unsustainable consumption, production, and so on and so forth. But if you have countries that have the the lands to feed their cattle, they grow them naturally without any induction or any using genetically modified substances and so on, then I think that is fine. At the end of the day, we are talking about the values in all of our food production system, and we are talking about behavioral change that we are after, and the the sustainability of consumption and production in general. So let's think holistically, right? And not specifically go after one thing without thinking of the other elements, and this applies to an animal based diet as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Iyad. Unfortunately, this will be the last question, and we will have to wrap up. And it's about land. So Rukhsana, I'll pose it to you, but if anyone else wants to come in as well, there's a question around the question they've put in quote marks, ethical land use. I'm not sure if that's a technical term or that's a term this person is using, but how to address the competing demands for land. So whether that's carbon sequestration or sustainable housing or for ecosystem restoration, as populations grow, land is going to become more and more rare, or, and so I'm just wondering how to balance the demands for different land use. I'm wondering if you could, I know, again, that's a big topic, if you can speak to that in a couple of minutes.
So in our discussion, what we look at is equal ownership of land, right? So men and women, and in certain societies, how women have been deprived from having control over their land. And it can be sometimes happen legally. And so we want to advocate for the reform of such laws. And then even in certain cases where women have equal ownership of land legally, there are customary practices actually which prevent women from owning land. And that can have a number of effects on food systems within the family and within the environment that they live, right? So who controls land is actually a big question, but I think more and more land control is moving towards big companies. As I said, 1% of the biggest farm companies own 70% of the world farms land. And that as a huge land inequality and inequality in general. And why does that happen when you look at land ownership? It's because of the policies that we take based on certain economic models that we practiced. And I think if you look at even some of the solutions to the climate change have been presented as economic models, like RED Plus programs, how indigenous peoples are not being included in that program, right? Even if you look at high net zero programs, they are extremely land intensive. And so the core factor here is that, like, who really owns the land? Sometimes people have been using this land for centuries, and they have been doing it sustainably, and they have primarily the local knowledge and capacity to restore the ecosystem, which have been degraded as well to a certain extent. And I think we need to legally empower such communities to restore land, restore traditional food systems, which have been countered by a number of factors that I have mentioned before. And finally, I have to say, my final remark is that we're talking about, eating meat. I mean, we can't preach people like, what not to eat, but I think we all as consumers have to make, in the era that we are living, very conscious decision. So I'm going to leave with one thought. So we have been talking about the clearance of Amazon over the last few years. And together with that, the land grabbing in the Amazon by these from the indigenous communities, from the people who have been using, land for a long period of time. And this land which has been grabbed and in the process of number of environmental and land defenders were killed, and they were grabbed by big industries in coalition with like very powerful parties, and they produce soya. And where does that soya go? That goes to feed animals, and which feed large proportion of the population in the global north as well. So I think we need to change that narrative and have different thinking in that process when you think about, oh, whether I'm going to eat meat or not. But I think we need to put that information out there, and it's up to people to make the final decision.
Thank you so much, Rukhsana, for that final point. And I think that's a point that I think people of all faith will resonate with, is that we all have to take personal responsibility for the decisions we make and how we show up in the world and the food that we purchase. So thank you for that last note. Unfortunately, we are at time. 90 minutes has flown by. I'd like to thank so much all of our panelists, Laura, Rukhsana, Lena, Oliver, Iyad, for your contributions today, but your friendship over the last couple of years. It's really been a joy working with all of you and your organizations. Thank you to all the organizations that supported this event today: World Vision International, the Faith for Earth Initiative at UNEP, the MENA Women's Coalition, the Interfaith Public Health Network, the Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation, Bread for the World, and the Center for Earth Ethics Faith and Food Coalition. We have 2 more sessions planned over the next month. The next session will be on the 13th of July, where we'll be hearing from grassroots activists around what they have seen and what they would like to see in terms of leading up to the stocktaking moment. And then we have a virtual side event on the 25th of July during the stocktaking moment in Rome. So I think the details for how to sign up are in the chat, so please sign up for those. Once again, on behalf of the Center for Earth Ethics, the Faith and Food Coalition, we really appreciate you joining us today, and we look forward to connecting with you soon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.